we got Adam and Eve, Noah and the ark, Moses at the Red Sea, Joshua and the walls of Jericho, David and Goliath. There's some Bible stories that don't really need an introduction. They're so well known that even people from outside the church, people who may have never actually read the Bible, have heard of it. By the way, that list could be much, much longer. But I think today there's one more we can add. Abraham and Isaac. A father and a son and a sacrifice. Our text this morning is Genesis 22, 1-14. After these things, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set it out, and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. And then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there, and we will worship, and then we will come back to you. Now Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them walked on together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. And when they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there, and laid an altar there, and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on top of the altar on top of wood. And then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and he saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and he took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This is one of those difficult passages in the Bible that have created all sorts of confusion and conflict over the centuries. I know of pastors with decades of experience who will not preach on this passage. And I know that I've wrestled with this one practically my whole life. This is one of those passages that seems to so clearly demonstrate that there's a difference to me between the angry and vengeful God of the Old Testament and the loving God of the New Testament, as demonstrated in the person of Jesus. And how do you reconcile those 2 disparate impressions of God? On the one hand, you've got Jesus, love and grace personified, who specifically and deliberately reached out to the marginalized and the unwanted. And how does that fit with the sheer monstrousness of asking Abraham to sacrifice his long-awaited only son? But I think we really have to look at context. Like that surprises you all, right? That I'm going to give you context. So try at this moment, I want you to see it's going to be difficult. Try to forget everything you know or think you know about God and religion. Because God and religion so permeate our culture that it's hard to set that aside and think about the story, as with so many Bible stories, without that filter in place. To read it and think about it in the way the characters in the story and the hearers of that story would have understood it. So in this case, we need to set aside our knowledge of Christianity, even our knowledge of Judaism. Abraham predates even Judaism. So basically, everything we know about religion today, we need to kind of push that off. Because this was a much more primitive time. A time when people were trying to find answers. Would their crops get enough rain? Would they get enough sun? Would their children stay healthy? control, and they came to the conclusion that they were dependent upon unseen forces for their survival, which actually was a monumental leap in that time. And they came to believe that these forces are either on their side or they weren't. They were either for them or against them. Their crops grow or they don't. They're able to have kids or not. Their animals stay healthy or they get sick. So the big question that they had was, how do they keep these forces on their side? So the next time they had a great harvest, they gave a portion of that harvest to those forces, which they had taken to calling gods and goddesses, to show their gratitude, because they determined that they needed these gods on their side, and this is all lowercase g. So they built altars and offered sacrifices. But then what happened when people would offer a sacrifice, but then it didn't rain, or the sun didn't shine, or the animals still got diseases, or the woman was still barren? Obviously, they concluded they didn't offer enough. So the next time they offered more, and then more, and then more. And these gods were understood to be angry and capricious and demanding, and one never knew where you stood with these gods. And if you didn't please them, they would punish you by sending calamity and ruin. Your livestock would die, your crops would wither, you wouldn't get enough rain, or you'd get too much. Your children would get sick and die. I mean, what if they were pleased with you? They'd reward you, right? Your livestock would thrive. There'd be just the right amount of rain, neither too much nor too little, so your crops would flourish, as would your children. So the next time, you need to offer the gods thanks for their blessings. So how would you know if you offered them enough? That you showed them enough gratitude, as you offered them enough so that if things went well, you never knew. And if things didn't go well, you clearly hadn't done enough. So how would you know if you'd sacrificed enough? To quote theologian, author, and former pastor Ron Bell, whether things went well or not, the answer was always sacrifice more, give more, offer more, because you never knew where you stood with the gods. And so you'd offer part of your crop, and then you'd offer a goat, and maybe a lamb, maybe a cow, maybe a few cows, maybe some birds. The very nature of early religion is that everything escalated because of your anxiety to please the gods. You kept having to offer more. And what's the most valuable thing you could offer the gods to show them how serious you were about earning their favor? A child. Can you see how child sacrifice lurks on the edges of the Old Testament? It's where religion took you, to the place where you offer that which was most valuable to you. Did anybody ever notice in this story that Abraham didn't ask Yahweh how to make the sacrifice? I mean, it's not like he could Google it. How do you sacrifice your child? There was no, Lord, I don't know how to do this. How does one go about child sacrifice? There were no questions asked at all. None. Not a single solitary query. It's kind of like Abraham already knew how to perform child sacrifice. Like maybe it wasn't some outrageous, unthinkable act, but something that was actually rather commonplace. And I would disagree with Reverend Bell that child sacrifice was lurking around the edges of the Old Testament, because there's no lurking involved. It was right there, apparently tempting the Israelites. Let me correct that. Apparently it was doing more than tempting them. It was actually being performed by the Israelites. Leviticus 18 instructs, you shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Molech, and so profane the name of the Lord your God. 2 Kings talks of King Josiah and his reforms, and he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one would make a son or daughter pass through the fire as an offering to Molech. And Ezekiel says, when you offer your gifts and make your children pass through the fire, you defile yourselves with all idols to this day. Jeremiah has two different warnings against child sacrifice. In 7, he says, "For the people of Judah have done evil in my sight, says the Lord. They have set their abominations in a house that is called by my name, defiling it. And they go on building the high place of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind." And then later, Jeremiah says, "Because the people have forsaken me and have profaned this place by making offerings to other gods whom their ancestors, nor the kings of Judah, have known, building the high places of Baal to burn their children in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal." Now, many of you know Micah 6:8. I've got it on the back of my business cards, right? "He has told you, O mortal, what is good and what does God the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and walk humbly with your God." But how many of you know the verse that immediately precedes that, which says, "Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" And then finally, there's the story of Jephthah in Judges chapter 11. Jephthah was a judge over Israel, and he led him in a battle against Ammon. And in exchange for defeating the Ammonites, he made a vow to sacrifice whatever would come out of the door of his house first. And as his daughter exited the house, he immediately regretted the vow, which would mean sacrificing his daughter to God. And at the end of 2 months, he did with her according to the vow he had made. You know, if I were named after Jephthah, like that Duck Dynasty dude was, I'd be wanting to have a talk with my parents and ask them, why on earth would you name me after Jephthah? By the way, the valley of Ben Hinnom, which means the son of Hinnom, where they built the high place of Topheth. Topheth is like a children's graveyard. It's a valley on the outskirts of Jerusalem where child sacrifices were being performed they weren't over there. They weren't being done by those people. The child sacrifices were being performed by Israelites in Jerusalem in a valley that wound up being used as a dump where people would burn their trash. By the way, the Greek version of that is Gehenna, so when you hear Gehenna, they're referring to the valley that was associated with child sacrifice. Dr. Josephine Quinn of Oxford University says, "We should not imagine that ancient people thought like us and were horrified by the same things. People looked at it differently 2,500 years ago. Indeed, contemporary Greek and Roman writers tend to describe the practice of child sacrifice as more of an eccentricity or historical oddity, and they're not actually very critical of it." So back to Abraham. When God tells Abraham to offer his son, Abraham isn't shocked. Just early in the morning, he got up and he loaded up his donkey. He gets right to it. He doesn't argue. He doesn't protest. He doesn't drag his feet. He doesn't even ask for instructions. He clearly knows what to do, and so he does it. Of course, because that's how Abraham understood that the world worked. Yahweh was new, making himself known on the scene. All those previous gods demanded that which was most valuable to you, and if you didn't give it, you'd pay the price. And that's how people saw things at the time. So on the way up the mountain to the high place, Isaac asked Abraham, "Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Where is the sacrifice coming from?" And Abraham gives them the non-answer, right? God will provide. We have no indication that Abraham knows there's going to be a last-minute reprieve. We have to assume that he's just dodging Isaac's question, and he fully intends to sacrifice his son. But we, the listener to the story, then Abraham, who gets ready to offer his son, but he doesn't, because God stops him and offers a ram instead. And that's the end of the story, except that it isn't. The angel shows up and says that Abraham is going to be blessed, and through his offspring all nations will be blessed. But we're left with the lingering, caustic question: what kind of God would ask a man to sacrifice his son? But see, the answer is not this one. The other gods may demand your firstborn, but not this God, not Yahweh. So if God doesn't want Abraham to offer a son, why the charade? Why order Abraham to sacrifice Why let him get all the way to the altar before calling a halt to the proceedings? Let me read you Pastor Bell's take on it. He says, first, the drama is the point. Abraham knows what to do when he's told to offer his son, because this is always where religion heads in that time. So at first, in this story, Yahweh appears to be like all the other gods, Baal and Molech and their ilk. And the story is like all the other stories about God's demanding acts of devotion and obedience, about gods who are never satisfied. The first audience for the story would have heard all of this before. It would have been familiar territory. So it's all about the drama, but then it's not. The story takes a shocking turn that comes out of nowhere, because this God, Yahweh God, disrupts the familiarity by interrupting the sacrifice. I can picture an early audience gasping, wait, what? This God stopped the sacrifice? Gods don't do that. And second, the God in this story provides. Worship and sacrifice was about you giving to the gods, and yet this story is about this God, Yahweh God, giving to Abraham. A God who does the giving, a God who does the providing. To quote the Princess Bride, it's inconceivable. See, I do think that obedience is a lesson to this story. I do think that God will provide is a lesson from this story. I'm just not sure that's the main lesson. Bell says the point of the Abraham Isaac story isn't that you should sacrifice your kid, but that you can leave behind any notion of a God who demands that you sacrifice your kid. In Genesis alone, the very first book of the Bible, there are many, many instances where Yahweh is shown to be unlike any other God that people may have heard of. The story of Abraham and Isaac is one of the first big lessons that teach us the uniqueness of our God. And through this story in particular, we see Yahweh telling his children, forget everything you know about gods and religion. Because I'm different. Because Yahweh is different. Yahweh is not a God who is increasingly difficult to appease. Yahweh provides for his children. See, the Bible story is an arc, and it tells our story, how we became the children of God, and what it means to be a child of God. To be a child of a God who is not like other gods. To worship a God who is not selfish, a God who provides